On a stormy night over the Black Sea, the sky is a sheet of ink and lightning. Somewhere in that darkness, a single radar trace appears on a Turkish scope. Just a blip at first, then a fast-moving streak cutting straight out of Soviet airspace. In a control room in Trabzon, Turkish operators lean over their screens, listening as a tense voice in heavily accented English comes through the radio. He is wounded, short of breath, and repeating the same desperate sentence. He says he is bringing in a Soviet fighter jet and he does not want to go back. Hundreds of miles away, American intelligence officers on Turkish soil are picking up the same signal, watching the same trace, and instantly understanding what it means. A frontline NATO state has just become the landing strip for one of the most advanced warplanes in the Soviet arsenal, and for the man who decided to steal it. This is the kind of scene that played out more than once along the edges of the Soviet Empire, and time after time, the same pattern emerged. The Kremlin tried to seal its people in behind an iron curtain of concrete and fear, while the United States quietly built networks, technologies, and alliances that could intercept, receive, and sometimes spirit away those who chose to run. Turkey, sitting on the Black Sea and sharing a land border with the USSR, was one of the sharpest points on that line. Tonight, you will travel along that edge, through airfields, safe houses, courtrooms, and intelligence backrooms, to see how Turkish territory, American technology, and Soviet terror collided in stories of escape that the Kremlin never wanted anyone to hear. After World War II, Turkey watched the map of Europe harden into something dangerous. To the north and northeast stood the Soviet Union, demanding changes to the control of the Turkish Straits and hinting at base rights that would have turned the Black Sea into a Soviet lake. Turkish leaders knew exactly what that meant. If they stood alone, they would eventually be swallowed. So they made a choice. Turkey moved decisively toward the west, signed up for the Truman Doctrine, and joined NATO in 1952, turning its territory into a fortified hinge between the Soviet bloc and the Mediterranean world. For American planners, that decision was a gift. Turkey offered air bases within reach of the Caucasus, listening posts aimed at Soviet missile tests, and ports looking straight into the Black Sea. Very quickly, U.S. and British intelligence services moved in. They set up signals intelligence sites on hills and mountains, tuning in to Soviet radar, radio chatter, and telemetry from test ranges deep inside the USSR. They trained Turkish officers, shared equipment, and quietly helped build stay-behind networks that could fight a Soviet invasion from the shadows if the tanks ever rolled across the border. For Washington, Turkey became an outpost of the American-led West, pressed right up against the Soviet frontier. For Moscow, it became a problem that never went away. Every Soviet officer who looked at a map and saw U.S. bases at Incirlik and elsewhere knew that if a citizen ever slipped across that line, they would be stepping directly into the arms of the most sophisticated intelligence system on Earth. Inside the Soviet Union, ordinary people were told that the frontier was closed. The message was simple: the border is electrified, the sea is patrolled, the sky is watched, and if you cross the line without permission, you will be shot or jailed for treason. Behind that fear, however, lay a different reality. The Soviet system was full of cracks in morale, in ideology, and in the loyalty of those who served it. Some of the men given access to its most sensitive secrets, its most advanced weapons, or its propaganda machinery looked around and decided that the price of obedience was too high. They became defectors, people willing to risk everything to get out, often in a single decisive leap. On the other side of the curtain, the United States quietly prepared for that moment. The CIA built specialized programs, units, and safe facilities for handling defectors, from low-level sailors and border guards to high-ranking intelligence officers and rocket scientists. These units had one job: take frightened, exhausted human beings arriving from a police state and turn their knowledge into an advantage, without getting them killed in the process. Defectors were given new identities, debriefed for weeks or months, and sometimes used in further operations as double agents or recruiters. Some were moved through safe houses in Austria or Germany. Others, especially those who fled by air or sea near the Black Sea, washed up first on the shores or in the airports of Turkey. And that is where the story becomes uniquely intense. Imagine an air base on the Black Sea coast in the spring of 1989. On the tarmac sits a jet that Soviet engineers are proud of, the MiG-29 Fulcrum, a frontline fighter designed to face off against American F-15s and F-16s. For years, Western analysts had pored over grainy photographs of this aircraft, guessing at its true capabilities. One of the pilots assigned to it was Captain Alexander Zuyev. He had gone through the Soviet system, worn the uniform, and flown the missions. But as the years passed, he saw the corruption, the lies, and the brutality up close. He realized that the regime he served would never change on its own. Zuyev did something that none of his comrades dared do. He began to plan not just an escape, but an escape with his jet. He studied routines, guard rotations, and weaknesses. On the day he chose, he drugged the pastries at the squadron's celebration, causing most of the personnel to collapse from exhaustion. Then he moved. He overpowered the guard at the MiG-29, took a gunshot in the struggle, and dragged himself into the cockpit, bleeding but determined. He started the engines, taxied out under sporadic gunfire, and rolled down the runway with enough fuel to cross the Black Sea. As Soviet officers scrambled in disbelief, the jet lifted off and pointed not toward another Soviet base, but toward the south, toward Turkey. Within minutes, Turkish radar saw an unidentified military aircraft crossing the Black Sea straight out of Soviet airspace. In the tower at Trabzon, controllers heard a shaky voice in English identifying himself as a Soviet pilot seeking asylum, insisting he would not turn back. For the Turkish government, it was a diplomatic bomb. For the Soviet command, it was a nightmare. One of their best aircraft, flown by one of their own officers, was about to fall intact into NATO hands, unless something could be done. For American intelligence officers watching from nearby, it was an almost unbelievable opportunity. The MiG-29 landed at Trabzon with Zuyev wounded and the plane still armed. Turkish security forces surrounded the jet, disarmed it, and took Zuyev into custody. According to later accounts, his first clear words to his captors were, "At last, I'm American," a carefully chosen signal designed to leave no doubt about his intentions. Within hours, Soviet diplomats demanded that both plane and pilot be returned. Moscow insisted that Zuyev was a criminal hijacker, not a political refugee. They wanted their man and their machine back, and they wanted them quickly. Ankara now stood at the center of a triangle. On one side was the Soviet Union, furious and watching every move. On another were its NATO allies, especially the United States, eager to get access to both the pilot's knowledge and the secrets inside the MiG-29 systems. On the third side was Turkish national interest: maintain stability with a powerful neighbor, but also prove reliability as part of the Western alliance. The Turkish government made a choice that reveals how this game was really played. They eventually allowed Soviet pilots to fly the MiG-29 back home, proving to Moscow that Turkey would not be the one to strip its most modern fighter down to the last bolt. But when it came to Zuyev himself, they did something very different. Turkish courts tried him for hijacking, then dismissed the charges as political, recognizing that his act was not simple air piracy, but a defection. He was not handed back to face execution or a labor camp. Instead, quiet arrangements were made, and Alexander Zuyev left Turkey for the United States, where he was granted asylum, wrote a memoir, and spent the rest of his life under American protection. Imagine sitting in a Soviet command bunker reading those reports. You recover your precious jet, but you know, deep down, that even a short stay in Turkish hands may have allowed Western technicians to learn more than you ever wanted about its avionics and systems. You see that the pilot you called a traitor is now giving interviews, testifying before Western audiences, and exposing your weaknesses. You realize that, once again, American networks, lawyers, and intelligence handlers turned a moment of chaos into a long-term strategic advantage. That is the emotional pivot that repeats across all these stories. The Soviet system tried to present itself as unshakable, but every time a highly trained officer fled to the West through Turkish airspace or waters, it revealed just how porous that reality really was. And every time, American institutions, intelligence agencies, courts, diplomats showed that they could process, protect, and exploit that defection with a sophistication the Kremlin simply could not match in reverse. Not every escape involved a high-tech fighter jet. Sometimes it was just a man in a small inflatable boat, alone with a compass and a terrifying stretch of water. One such case involved a former officer of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces named Murat Kerimov. Fed up with the system he had once served, Kerimov chose perhaps the most desperate route of all. He set out across the Black Sea in a tiny rubber dinghy roughly 3 meters long, carrying barely enough food and water to survive a few days. For hours and then days, waves battered his boat. He drifted alone under the same sky that Soviet admirals claimed to control with their fleets, and under the same radar horizon that Soviet border troops claimed to seal. Yet when he finally staggered onto Turkish shores, it was not Soviet sailors who found him. It was Turkish authorities, and behind them, Western intelligence officers who instantly understood what a strategic rocket forces officer might know about missile deployments, launch procedures, and command culture. On paper, Kerimov was just an illegal arrival, soaked and half-starved. In the real geometry of the Cold War, he was a potential goldmine of information. American defector programs were built to recognize that difference. They could take a man in that condition, feed him, question him, verify his story, and then decide how best to use his knowledge, whether as a witness in public campaigns or as a silent source in classified assessments. Meanwhile, from the Soviet side, the scene looked like a nightmare. A former missile officer had slipped through the very sea they claimed to dominate, reached territory of a NATO state, and now sat in a room somewhere in Turkey telling American and Allied analysts how things really worked inside their most sensitive branch. No amount of propaganda about the superiority of the socialist system could erase that image. Behind these dramatic moments lay a deeper layer of cooperation that remained almost entirely invisible to the public. Declassified research into U.S.-Turkish intelligence ties reveals how far this went. One CIA document on a project known as AEACRE mentions something intriguingly titled Project Turkish Red Sox. At the request of Turkish partners, this project involved recruiting, training, dispatching, and exfiltrating agents from the Soviet Turkmen region east of the Caspian Sea, followed by field debriefings. In other words, Turkish and American services were not just reacting to defectors, they were actively sending people into Soviet territory and bringing them back out. The same file describes how a recent young Soviet Army defector was used to recruit a Soviet engineer still in place, showing how defectors could become tools in a much larger operation rather than simply disappearing into quiet retirement. This is where technology and human daring met. Clandestine radios, encrypted communications, safe exfiltration routes, and rapid debriefing techniques made it possible to turn one man's decision to flee into a chain of new sources deep inside the Soviet system. Turkey's geography was essential to this. From its territory, you could reach the Caucasus, the Black Sea coast, and parts of Central Asia more easily than from anywhere else in NATO. Signals intelligence stations in Turkey could support these operations, tracking Soviet responses, following troop movements, and even detecting when Moscow's security services started to panic. For Soviet counterintelligence officers, that combination was chilling. They were not just facing a single hostile service. They were up against a tightly woven network of partners, Turkish, American, British, and others, who shared information, platforms, and tools in ways the Soviet bloc never fully replicated on its own side. To grasp how distinctive Turkey's role was, it helps to compare it to another famous escape corridor, the route of Soviet Jews through Austria. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, tens of thousands of Soviet Jews were allowed to emigrate, often traveling through Vienna and sometimes Rome, before going on to Israel, the United States, or other countries. Austria developed a whole infrastructure around this flow: transit centers, NGO support, and established bureaucratic routines that turned the Vienna hub into a known, if sometimes contested, gateway. Turkey's story is different. There is no public evidence that Ankara or its intelligence service ran a mass, structured pipeline of that scale, specifically to move Soviet citizens through its territory into Western Europe. What we do see instead is a pattern of intense, case-by-case handling of defectors whose routes happen to cross Turkish soil or waters. The MiG-29 pilot, the missile officer in the dinghy, the would-be hijackers who never made it out of Soviet airspace but clearly saw Turkey as a reachable Western gateway. The NKVD officer Konstantin Volkov, who tried to defect in Istanbul in 1945 by approaching the British consulate, only to be betrayed within the British system itself and snatched away before he could escape. Each story is different, but the geography is the same. A Soviet citizen looking south or west and seeing Turkey as the first piece of non-Soviet ground that might lead to freedom. Each time, Soviet leaders are forced to watch as that individual either vanishes into the Western defector machinery or dies trying to get there. The emotional core for an American audience lies in this contrast. On one side, a system that tries to seal people in with barbed wire, patrol boats, and political terror. On the other, a system that has built the tools to receive those who manage to break through and to turn their stories and knowledge into long-term advantages. Think about what it means that when a stolen MiG-29 lands in Trabzon, there are already protocols, liaison officers, and intelligence frameworks ready to act. Think about how striking it is that a strategic rocket forces officer in a rubber boat is not just tossed into a cell as a random illegal immigrant, but recognized as a source worth debriefing in depth. Behind every one of those scenes are American engineers designing secure communication systems, American analysts building defector handling doctrine, and American diplomats crafting language that allows Turkey to satisfy both alliance obligations and its desire to avoid unnecessary war scares. The Soviet Union could rant and threaten, it could demand extraditions and issue condemnations, But it could not match the combination of legal process, technological infrastructure, and alliance-wide intelligence cooperation that turned each successful defection into a quiet strategic victory for the West. For Soviet generals and KGB chiefs, that asymmetry was deeply unsettling. They knew that a single pilot, a single engineer, a single signals officer slipping through the Black Sea or the Turkish frontier could undo years of secrecy around weapon systems, procedures, or covert operations. They also knew that once that person crossed the line, the chances of ever getting them back were slim. The Americans and their allies had built a machine designed to absorb such people and make sure they never had to return. Over and over, you can build episodes around the same repeating pattern. You start with the human drama at the edge of Soviet power, a man limping out of a cockpit in Trabzon with blood on his flight suit, facing armed Turkish soldiers and wondering if he has just traded one set of guards for another. A rubber boat scraping onto a stony Turkish beach at dawn, its occupant too weak to stand, collapsing into the arms of confused fishermen and coast guards. You then pull back to show the bigger board. You explain how, years earlier, Turkey joined NATO, hosted American bases, and allowed the CIA and MI6 to set up joint intelligence sites aimed squarely at the USSR. You show how that decision turned what would otherwise have been local immigration incidents into crises that shook desks in Moscow, Washington, and every capital in between. Next, you reveal the machinery that the United States and its partners had ready for exactly this kind of moment. Special defector units inside the CIA, trained debriefers with interpreters and psychologists, secure facilities where a man like Zuyev could be questioned for weeks about MiG tactics, radar signatures, and cockpit procedures, all while lawyers worked to ensure he could not simply be handed back to the regime he betrayed. Finally, you bring the viewer back to the Soviet perspective. You make them feel what it meant to be a general in Moscow, reading the cable that says another officer of yours has arrived in a NATO country with vital secrets in his head. You remind them that there was no mirror image of this on the Western side, no steady stream of American missile officers or fighter pilots fleeing into the arms of the KGB through Cuban or East German embassies. The traffic was almost entirely one way. That is where pride, fascination, and curiosity come together. Pride in how thoroughly American institutions prepared for these moments. Fascination with the individual courage it took to make that leap. Curiosity about the hidden technical and political machinery that sprang into action every time a Soviet citizen managed to reach Turkish soil. Ironically, some of the most powerful American tools in these stories were not weapons at all, but information systems. Secure communications that allowed a Turkish official in Trabzon to talk to U.S. officers and NATO commanders within minutes of a defector landing. Databases and watch lists that could verify a name, a unit, or a branch of service almost immediately. Intelligence methods that turned each new arrival into a cross-check against satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and previous human sources. The Soviet Union prided itself on its security organs, but they were built to keep people from leaving, not for processing the psychological shock when they did. Stations along the Black Sea or in the Caucasus were designed to shoot at escapees, not to persuade them to come back with gentle promises and legal guarantees. Once someone slipped through that net and hit a place like Turkey, the Soviets had only one blunt instrument left: pressure, diplomatic notes, public accusations, threats cloaked in formal language. Watching from the United States, you can see how little that ultimately did. The MiG-29 went home, but the pilot didn't. The rubber boat was hauled up on a Turkish beach, but the man who paddled it ended up under Western protection. Each time, Soviet power ended at the waterline of Turkish jurisdiction. Beyond that, American and Allied systems took over, and the Kremlin could only grind its teeth. In the end, the story of Turkish intelligence cooperation and Soviet defectors is not the story of a massive underground railroad run entirely from Ankara. It's the story of a frontier state that chose the West, opened its territory to American bases and sensors, and then found itself repeatedly at the crossroads when individuals decided to test the limits of Soviet control. For American viewers, it offers a powerful way to revisit the Cold War that goes far beyond missile counts and summit meetings. It lets you see how the abstract idea of freedom was made real in metal and flesh. A stolen jet screaming over the Black Sea, a battered dinghy on an open horizon, a courtroom in Turkey quietly ruling that a man who stole his own plane was not a criminal but a political refugee. And above all, it shows how often, at the moment when the Soviet system cracked and someone slipped through, the advantage lay with American technology, American planning, and American partnerships. The Iron Curtain was supposed to be absolute, but along the shores of Turkey, it turned out that the United States had built something even stronger, a network ready to catch those who fell through that curtain, protect them, and turn their stories into one more reason the Soviet Union ultimately couldn't keep up.